There is a statistic I stumbled across on a late night YouTube rabbit hole that I haven't been able to burn out of my head since last October. It claimed that 7% of all people who go missing in North American forests are never found, not even a scrap of clothing or a boot print, despite modern satellite tracking and canine search teams. 7%. It doesn't sound like a lot until you start doing the math on the sheer volume of human bodies that just vanish into the green. But what the video didn't mention, what the algorithms can't quantify, is the percentage of people who do come back but leave the actual mechanics of their lives behind in the brush. My name is Gareth Goodson, and until 6 months ago, I was a line cook at a high-volume seafood spot near Boston Harbor. I used to pride myself on my calluses, the steady rhythm of a 13-hour shift, and the absolute predictability of a well-oiled kitchen. Now, I can't even look at a raw rack of lamb without my stomach turning over, and the sound of dry leaves scraping across asphalt makes me want to bolt the doors from the inside. I'm telling you this because you're the only one who won't look at me like I've had a psychotic break, and because if I don't get it out of my own head, it's going to rot there. I had 2 weeks of accrued paid time off that I had to use before the fiscal year ended, and I wanted to get as far away from the steam tables and the smell of old frying oil as possible. I've always been a film buff, specifically old, low-budget atmospheric horror, and I had this romanticized, stupid idea of doing a solo autumnal road trip through the old, forgotten pockets of the South. I packed my old sedan, grabbed my heavy canvas jacket, and decided to drive down toward the inner coastal plains of North Carolina. The map segment I picked was Bladen County. If you've ever looked up local American folklore, you might have run across the Beast of Bladenboro. Back in the winter of 1954, this tiny town called Bladenboro was gripped by hysteria because something was systematically slaughtering local dogs, crushing their skulls, breaking their spines, and reportedly draining every single drop of blood from their bodies. The old newspaper archives called it a vampire beast. Some thought it was a rogue panther, but the locals who actually saw it described something else: a massive, low-slung feline canine hybrid that moved with a terrifying, unnatural speed. To me, sitting in a comfortable apartment in Massachusetts, it was just a cool piece of regional history. A perfect backdrop for a lonely, atmospheric vacation. The drive from Boston down to Bladenboro is roughly 800 miles, about 12 to 13 hours if you don't stop, except for gas, which was the absolute limit of what I could do in a single stretch. By the time I crossed the state line into North Carolina, the weather had completely turned. The crisp, bright New England autumn vanished, replaced by a low, suffocating shelf of iron-gray clouds that seemed to hover just above the tree line. The air down here was different. It was thick, wet with delayed moisture, smelling heavily of damp pine needles, swamp gas, and cold, stagnant mud. The trees weren't the vibrant oranges and reds of home. They were ragged, loblolly pines and ancient, twisted live oaks, choked with grey wraps of Spanish moss that hung down like dirty hair. As I pulled off the main highway onto the 2-lane state roads that led into Bladenboro, the daylight began to bleed out of the sky. turning everything into a monochrome blur of dark bark and pale sand. I had rented a small, isolated cabin through a short-term leasing site, located about 6 miles outside the town proper, right on the fringes of the bogs that feed into the Cape Fear River. The listing had been cheap, suspiciously cheap, but the photos showed a rustic, clean timber cabin with a decent kitchen, which was all I cared about. The town itself, when I drove through it at dusk, felt like a place that had drawn its curtains and gone to sleep 30 years ago. A few brick storefronts, a single flashing yellow light at the main intersection, and a heavy, palpable stillness that didn't feel like peace. It felt like caution. I found the gravel turnout for the cabin just as the final grey light died into absolute pitch black. The tires crunched loudly on the wet stones, the sound unnaturally sharp in the quiet woods. When I cut the engine, the silence that rushed in to fill the void was total. No crickets, no night birds, no wind through the pines. Just the rhythmic tink, tink, tink of my car's cooling manifold. I unpacked my grocery bags, mostly coffee, dry pasta, and a few ribeyes I'd brought in a cooler, and hauled them up the 3 wooden steps to the porch. The cabin was basic: a main room with a stone hearth, a small kitchenette, and a sleeping loft accessible by a sturdy pine ladder. It was around 10 in the evening when I finished setting up. I'm a creature of habit, so even on vacation, I went through my evening ritual, checking the burners on the small gas stove, laying out paring knives and my heavy 8-inch carbon steel bust-off chef's knife on the magnetic strip I'd brought with me. A good knife is a cook's security blanket. It's an extension of your arm, balanced and predictable. I sat down at the small wooden table with a glass of rye whiskey, intending to map out a hiking trail for the next morning, when I heard the first sound that didn't belong to the house. It wasn't a howl or a roar. It was a heavy, rhythmic thudding on the damp earth outside, followed by the distinct, unmistakable sound of something large dragging itself against the rough cedar siding of the cabin. The wood groaned slightly under a massive shifting weight. My initial thought was a stray black bear. The rental description had mentioned they were common in the river lowlands. I stood up, my boots loud on the pine floorboards, and walked toward a small, double-pane window that looked out into the front clearing where my car was parked. The clouds had parted just enough for a weak, greasy sliver of moonlight to filter through the canopy. At first I saw nothing but the silver-gray shape of my sedan. Then I noticed the silhouette. Standing beside the driver's side door wasn't a bear. It was too narrow through the hips, too long in the limbs. It was hunched over, its front digits resting on the roof of my car, its head lowered as if it were listening to the residual heat of the engine. The sheer scale of it didn't register until I saw its shoulder joints rising well above the roofline of the vehicle. It was covered in a sparse, matted coat of dark, wet fur that looked almost black in the dark, but it was the posture that froze the breath in my throat. It wasn't balanced like an animal. It possessed a terrible, deliberate posture that suggested an anatomy capable of shifting between 2 legs and 4 with complete fluid ease. I stood there, paralyzed, the glass of whiskey cold in my hand, watching this thing through 2 layers of glass. Then, with a slow, horrifyingly casual motion, The creature turned its head toward the cabin window. It didn't have the round, blunt snout of a feline, nor the elongated, slender muzzle of a typical timber wolf. It was broader, heavier, with a massive blocky jaw structure that looked designed for crushing dense bone. But it was the eyes that broke something inside me, my understanding of the natural world. They didn't reflect the moonlight with the green or yellow tapetum lucidum shine of a deer or a dog. They were dark, set deep beneath a heavy prominent brow ridge, and they didn't wander. They locked onto me instantly. Through the darkness, through the glass, it looked directly into my face with a terrifying, cold, calculative intelligence. It didn't snarl. It didn't bray. It just watched me back, evaluating the distance between us, measuring the thickness of the pine door, and deciding exactly what I was worth. The silence that followed that look was heavier than the North Carolina air. I didn't blink. I couldn't. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and my breath fogged the window pane, blurring the creature's silhouette into a dark, shifting smudge. The beast didn't react to my panic with an animal's immediate aggression. Instead, it did something infinitely worse. It slowly let go of my car roof, its long, clawed digits making a soft ting against the metal, and dropped into a low, deliberate crouch. It moved with a territorial smooth grace, its rear joints bending in a way that looked completely unnatural for its massive bulk, lowering its center of gravity until it was nearly invisible against the dark gravel. Then it began to circle. It didn't rush the porch, it moved along the periphery of the clearing, keeping just on the edge of the weak moonlight, its eyes never leaving the window where I stood. Every few paces, it would pause, its head tilting slightly to one side, as if it were listening to the frantic, erratic rhythm of my pulse. I remembered a detail from an old forum post I'd read while researching the Bladenboro lore, an account from an old hunter in the 50s who claimed the thing didn't just hunt by scent, it hunted by the sound of fear, tracking the spiked adrenaline of its prey. At the time, I dismissed it as a creative writing. Standing in that dark cabin, I knew it was the absolute gospel truth. I forced my stiff legs to move, backing away from the window inch by inch until the interior wall blocked my view of the clearing. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped my glass, setting it down on the wooden table with a sharp click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. My eyes immediately darted to the magnetic strip on the wall. My heavy 8-inch Wusthof chef's knife was there, its carbon steel blade gleaming faintly in the shadow. I stepped across the room, wrapped my fingers around the familiar wooden handle, and pulled it down. The weight of the steel in my hand casually brought a sense of absolute control, a grounding certainty that I could handle whatever came across my station. Tonight, against whatever was pacing outside, it felt like a toothpick. I needed a better weapon, something with range. I remember the rental listing had mentioned a small utility closet on the back porch for firewood and basic tools. I crept toward the heavy back door, my bare feet silent on the floorboards, and gently turned the deadbolt. The lock slid back with a soft, oily click. I cracked the door open just an inch, the cool, damp night air rushing in, smelling strongly of sulfur and rotted pine needles. Reaching out onto the small back porch, My hands scrambled along the wall until my fingers wrapped around the cold, rough iron of a heavy-duty splitting maul left by the wood pile. It was old, the hickory handle slightly weathered, but the head was massive, at least 6 pounds of solid forged steel. I dragged it inside and bolted the door behind me. Just as the lock clicked into place, the entire cabin shuddered. A massive weight slammed against the front door, the heavy oak timbers groaning under the impact. It wasn't a random ramming, it was a single, concentrated strike, aimed directly at the deadbolt mechanism. The iron latch plates creaked, and a shower of fine wood dust drifted down into the room. I dropped to one knee behind the kitchen island, holding the splitting maul tight against my chest, my knuckles turning white. "It knows how doors work," a cold voice whispered in the back of my mind. "It isn't trying to break the wood, it's trying to break the lock." For 3 long minutes, nothing happened. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, punctured only by the drip of a leaky pipe beneath the sink. I kept my eyes locked on the bottom of the front door, watching the thin gap between the wood and the sill. Then, a shadow blocked the faint light from outside. Something was sniffing at the base of the door. It was a long, drawing inhalation, deep and wet, followed by a low, vibrating grumble that I felt in the soles of my feet rather than heard. It was a sound of profound frustration. The creature knew I was inside, it knew I was armed, and it was calculating the effort required to force its way through the reinforced oak versus the reward of a meal. Then, to my horror, the brass doorknob began to rattle. It didn't jiggle like a dog scratching at a barrier. It turned. Slowly, deliberately. The round metal knob twisted to the left until it hit the resistance of the locked deadbolt. My breath hitched in my throat. The sheer level of problem-solving capability displayed by that single action was more terrifying than any set of fangs or claws. This wasn't a beast driven by blind predatory instinct. This was an entity with an operational understanding of human mechanics. It was testing the perimeter, analyzing the structural weakness of my temporary sanctuary, and realizing that tonight the barrier was just strong enough to make a direct assault inefficient. With a sudden sharp scrape of claws against the exterior steps, the weight shifted away from the porch. I heard the heavy rhythmic thud of its paws moving down the gravel path, fading gradually into the dense brush toward the swamp. I didn't move from behind that kitchen island for the rest of the night. I sat there with the splitting maul across my lap and the chef's knife in my hand, my eyes darting between the windows as the grey dawn slowly, painfully, began to bleed through the clouds. I told myself I was going to pack my bags and drive straight back to Boston the second the sun was up. But deep down, I knew the road out was long, empty, and entirely surrounded by those same suffocating pines. The morning did nothing to wash away the grease of that night. The sky remained a flat, dead slate, and the mist didn't lift from the grass. It just hovered there, thick and wet, turning the pine forest into a series of pale, vertical ribs. I packed my bags with a frantic, uncoordinated speed, throwing my clothes and my knives back into my duffel bag without checking if they were clean. My only goal was the state line. I ran out to my sedan, my eyes scanning the tree line with every step, and threw the luggage into the trunk. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine didn't catch. It gave a hollow mechanical click. Just one. I popped the hood, my hands slick with nervous sweat, and stepped out into the damp cold. When I lifted the heavy metal lid, my stomach dropped so hard I felt physically sick. The thick rubber serpentine belt had been cleanly sliced through, and the main wiring harness leading to the alternator had been shredded into green and copper confetti. There were no teeth marks. There were long, deliberate gouges in the metal casing of the battery, where 4 parallel claws had dug in to anchor the weight while the other hand tore the wires loose. It hadn't just attacked my car, it had disabled it. It had marooned me. My phone had no service. The low valley and the heavy storm clouds had seen to that, so my only option was to walk toward the main road. I grabbed the 6-pound splitting maul from the cabin porch and started down the 2-mile gravel driveway, my boots sinking into the soft mud. I hadn't gone half a mile before I heard the sound of another vehicle approaching from the direction of the town. A battered, mud-splattered green pickup truck rumbled into view, its engine rattling loudly in the quiet woods. I waved my arms wildly, standing in the middle of the track until the truck screeched to a halt, its brakes squealing. The man who stepped out was old, his skin lined and dark like cured tobacco, wearing a faded orange hunting vest. His name was Dale Vance, a local surveyor who had lived in Bladenboro since the 60s. He took one look at my pale face and the heavy iron maul in my hand, and didn't ask any stupid questions. "You saw it," he said, his voice flat and gravelly. He didn't say an animal or a bear. He said it. I nodded, my throat too dry to form words, and pointed back toward my disabled car. Dale spat a stream of dark tobacco juice onto the gravel and opened the passenger door of his truck. "Get in," he said. "We're going to my cabin. You stay out here on foot after dark, and you're just a soft target." Dale's place was deeper in the woods but significantly more fortified than my rental. It was a low-slung concrete block structure with heavy steel bars over the small windows and a massive reinforced steel door that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. Inside the walls were lined with old topographical maps, dried herbs, and a glass-fronted gun cabinet containing 3 heavy-caliber hunting rifles. As the afternoon light began to die, Dale loaded rugged 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, sliding the heavy brass shells into the magazine tube with a rhythmic, comforting clacking. He handed me an old but meticulously clean .357 Magnum revolver from his belt. "It's got 6 rounds of heavy wad cutter," Dale said, looking me dead in the eye. "Don't aim for the chest. The height on that thing is dense enough to turn a slug if the angle is wrong. You aim for the soft skin under the jaw or the joints of the shoulder." We sat in the dark living room, illuminated only by the faint orange glow of a small kerosene lamp. Dale explained what the YouTube videos and the online forums had missed. "People think the 54 Beast just went away," he whispered, leaning close. "It didn't. It just learned. The hunters came with hundreds of hounds and searchlights, so it went deep into the green swamps where the horses couldn't follow. It's lived out there for 70 years, breeding, growing scar tissue, and watching us." It knows what a rifle is. It knows what a flashlight means. It's smarter than half the folks living in the town proper. Around midnight, the temperature inside the cabin plummeted. The air became so cold, our bread began to bloom in white, ragged plumes. Then the roof groaned. It wasn't the sound of wind or a falling branch. It was the distinct, heavy thud of a 200-pound weight landing squarely on the corrugated tin sheets above our heads. The metal popped and flexed under the pressure. Dale stood up instantly, raising the shotgun toward the ceiling, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. "It's checking the seams," he muttered under his breath. The creature moved across the roof with a terrifying spider-like agility, its claws scratching sharply against the metal. Then, without warning, the scratching stopped. A second later, the heavy glass of the high transom window above the steel door shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. A massive matted black arm reached through the narrow opening, an arm that looked horribly human in its articulation, but twice as thick, terminating in 5 long curved black talons. The arm swiped blindly through the dark, its claws tearing deep, ragged white gouges into the interior wood frame. Dale didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and fired both barrels of the 12-gauge into the opening. The deafening roar of the weapon filled the small concrete room, the muzzle flash illuminating the space with a blinding, white-hot glare. The buckshot shredded the window frame and caught the creature's arm. A spray of thick, dark, almost black blood splattered across the white ceiling, smelling instantly of copper and old rot. The beast let out a sound that I will hear until the day I die. Not a wolf's howl, but a high-pitched, mocking shriek of pure rage that sounded like a woman screaming through the metal pipe. The weight vanished from the roof as the creature leaped down into the brush, but before Dale could reload, the front steel door bucked inward. The creature had thrown its entire weight against the center of the frame from the outside. The heavy steel pins of the hinges groaned, bending at a sickening angle. Dale scrambled backward, dropping 2 fresh shells into the open breech of his gun, his hands shaking slightly for the first time. "Gareth," he yelled, "watch the back window. It doesn't hit the same place twice." Even as he said it, the concrete blocks around the small side window began to crack as the beast began to pry the iron bars right out of the mortar. The sound of the iron bars tearing loose from the dry mortar was like teeth grinding against stone. I spun around, my boots slipping on Dale's slick linoleum floor, and leveled the heavy 357 Magnum at the side window. The iron grate gave way with a final screeching pop, and through the dust, the creature's face shoved into the narrow opening. Up close, it was a tapestry of ancient violence. Its muzzle was crisscrossed with thick, hairless white scars from old buckshot, and its upper lip was curled back to reveal a row of crowded, yellowed incisors that were stained a deep rust brown. The dark eyes weren't wild with fear from the gunshot. They were cold, hyper-focused, and fixed entirely on me. I didn't think about my posture, my grip, or the proper stance I'd seen in movies. I just squeezed the trigger. The revolver bucked violently in my hands, the recoil sending a stinging shockwave up my forearms. The heavy, wad-cutter slug struck the concrete frame just inches from its ear, showering its face with sharp grey stone chips. The beast flinched, pulling its head back just enough for me to clear the kitchen island and scramble toward Dale at the front door. "The truck!" Dale roared over the ringing in my ears, his shotgun tucked tight into his shoulder as he fired another blast through the buckled front steel door to keep the creature back. We make for the truck right now, or we get boxed in this tomb. Dale hit the heavy slide bolt on the back door, the one leading directly toward his reinforced carport, and we burst out into the freezing wet night. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the foul, copper rot stench of the beast's blood. We scrambled into the cab of the green pickup, Dale diving from the driver's seat while I slammed the passenger door shut and locked it. The keys were already in the ignition. Dale twisted them, and the heavy V8 engine roared to life with a beautiful, sputtering cough that shook the entire frame of the vehicle. But before he could slide the transmission into reverse, a massive impact rocked the bed of the truck. The creature had leaped from the cabin roof straight into the back of the pickup. Through the small, sliding rear window of the cab, I saw its massive, matted torso press against the glass. Its right arm, the one shredded by Dale's buckshot, was leaking a steady stream of dark fluid, but its left hand was perfectly intact. It raised its heavy fist and smashed it into the glass. The window didn't just crack, it shattered inward, a storm of sharp, green safety glass spraying over our necks and shoulders. A massive, clawed hand reached through the opening, its fingers clawing wildly for the collar of Dale's hunting vest. Dale was pinned against the steering wheel, his breath coming in ragged, choking gasps as the creature's weight shifted the balance of the truck. I didn't have room to raise the long barrel of the revolver in the cramped cab, so I reached into my canvas jacket pocket and pulled out my last line of defense. My heavy, 8-inch carbon steel Wusthof chef's knife that I'd tucked away before leaving the rental cabin. I didn't hesitate. I drove the thick, rigid blade straight down into the meat of the creature's forefinger, right where the tendon met the main knuckle. The carbon steel bit deep, burying itself all the way to the wooden handle until it struck dense, heavy bone. The beast let out another one of those high-pitched metallic shrieks, its fingers convulsing instantly. It tore its hand back through the broken rear window, pulling my knife right out of my grip as it retreated. "Hold on!" Dale screamed, his face bright red as he slammed his boot down to the accelerator. The tire spun violently on the wet gravel, throwing a massive cloud of mud and stones behind us as the truck launched into reverse, slamming the rear tailgate directly into a thick, loblolly pine. The impact was tremendous, throwing the creature off balance and sending it tumbling out of the bed onto the rough gravel path. Dale shifted into drive, the transmission groaning in protest, and we tore down the narrow logging road toward the main state highway at 60 miles an hour, the headlights cutting through the swirling gray mist like twin blades. Through the shattered rear glass, I looked back just once. Standing in the middle of the gravel road, illuminated by the red glow of our tail lights, was the silhouette. It wasn't chasing us anymore. It was standing fully upright on two legs, its chest heaving, its long arms hanging loose at its sides. It didn't look defeated. It looked like a hunter watching a bird fly out of its reach, knowing that eventually the bird has to land. We hit the town limits of Bladenboro just as the sun began to break through the bottom of the iron clouds, turning the sky a bruised, yellowish purple. Dale didn't stop at the police station, and he didn't call the sheriff. He drove me straight to the county line, dropped me off at a small 24-hour diner with a working landline, and told me to take a bus back north and never look at a map of North Carolina again. I took his advice. I'm back in Boston now, working a dull, dry prep job in a bakery where nothing is raw and nothing moves after it's dead. But every night, when the 7% statistic pops up in my head, I look at the small, faint scar on my hand where the revolver's hammer bit into my skin, and I wonder how many of those people who vanish into the woods actually die, and how many of them are just being kept out there, trapped in a cabin somewhere, because something smart enough to disable a car is waiting for them to try and leave.